The fluorescent lights of Sullivan's auction house in Portland, Oregon, hummed above the cluttered estate sale lot. March 17, 2024. Dr. Rebecca Chen had driven 3 hours for this, navigating through spring rain to examine what the catalog vaguely described as vintage photography collection, circa 1900-1920. She specialized in early 20th century American photography at the Northwest Historical Archives, and estate sales like this were her hunting ground for forgotten pieces of history. The box sat in the back corner, marked simply Lot 47B Photos. Rebecca pulled on her white conservation gloves and began sorting through faded postcards, studio portraits, and family snapshots. Most were unremarkable. A child's birthday party, a man beside his automobile, weddings, graduations, the ordinary moments people chose to preserve. Then she saw it. The photograph stopped her cold. It was larger than the others, approximately 8 x 10 inches, printed on the heavy cardstock with an embossed border. The image showed a couple posing outdoors, clearly at some kind of fairground or circus. The man wore a dark suit and bowler hat, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a woman seated beside him. She wore an elaborate Victorian-era dress with ornate buttons running down the bodice, her hair styled fashionably under a decorative hat. Between them stood an enormous bird, an emu or ostrich, its long neck curved toward the camera. At first glance it seemed charming, whimsical even, the kind of novelty photograph wealthy people commissioned at traveling shows. But something felt wrong. Rebecca pulled out her illuminated magnifier, the same tool she used for authentication work at the archives. She moved it slowly across the photograph's surface, examining the details invisible to the naked eye. The woman's smile looked forced, her jaw tight. Her eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were fixed on something just beyond the frame. And her hands. Rebecca zoomed in on her hands. The left hand was positioned awkwardly in her lap, partially concealed by the folds of her dress. The right hand. Rebecca's breath caught. Around the woman's right wrist, barely visible beneath the cuff of her sleeve, ran a dark line. It wasn't a bracelet. The mark was too irregular, too deeply discolored against her skin. It looked like scarring, the kind left by prolonged friction, by restraints. Rebecca adjusted the magnifier, moving it up the woman's arm. There, another mark, this one more visible where the sleeve had ridden up slightly, and another on her left wrist, partially hidden, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. She examined the man next. His expression was different, confident, proprietary. His hand on the woman's shoulder wasn't gentle, the pressure of his grip visible in the way her dress fabric bunched beneath his fingers. And there was something else, something in his eyes that made Rebecca's skin crawl. A coldness, a sense of ownership that went beyond matrimonial affection. Rebecca flipped the photograph over. The back was marked with a photographer's stamp. Galveston and Brothers Photography, Chicago, Illinois, 1912. Below that, in faded ink, someone had written, Müller's Magnificent Traveling Show, Carla with Thomas. Just a first name for the woman, no last name. But the man got both. Rebecca photographed the back with her phone, then turned the image over again. She spent the next 20 minutes examining every millimeter of the photograph. The more she looked, the more details emerged. The slight lean of the woman's body, away from the man. The unnatural stiffness of her posture. The way her dress, despite its expensive appearance, didn't quite fit properly, as if it had been made for someone else. And those marks on her wrists, now that Rebecca had found them, she couldn't stop seeing them. She pulled out her phone and started cross-referencing. Müller's Magnificent Traveling Show appeared in several digitized newspaper archives from the early 1900s. It was one of dozens of circus and exhibition shows that crisscrossed America during that era. Most advertisements boasted similar attractions. Exotic animals, acrobats, strong men, and... Rebecca's scrolling stopped. Living exhibits, human curiosities, educational, ethnological demonstrations. The euphemisms made her stomach turn. She'd heard of these, of course. Every historian studying this period knew about them. The human zoos that displayed people of different ethnicities and cultures like animals. Africans, Pacific Islanders, indigenous peoples, even disabled individuals, all exhibited for profit under the guise of education and entertainment. But this woman, Carla, she looked European, white. So why would she be part of such a show? Rebecca's finger hovered over a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune, dated July 1912. The advertisement was elaborate, featuring illustrated borders and bold typography. Müller's magnificent traveling show, presenting wonders from across the globe. See the tallest woman in Illinois. Marvel at the tattooed lady from Borneo. Witness Carla the bird charmer and her death-defying ostrich. The bird charmer. Rebecca looked back at the photograph, at the enormous bird standing between the couple, at Carla's haunted eyes, at the scars on her wrists. She was about to put the photograph back in the box when something else caught her eye. In the background of the image, barely visible behind the man's shoulder, was another figure. Rebecca hadn't noticed it before because the exposure there was darker, the details less distinct. She held her magnifier directly over this spot and adjusted her desk lamp. It was another woman, standing perhaps 20 feet away. She appeared to be in some kind of cage. Rebecca dropped the magnifier. She grabbed the photograph, rushed to the auction house counter, and interrupted the clerk mid-sentence with another customer. Lot 47B, I'm buying it. The entire box. Now, name your price. The clerk blinked. Ma'am, the auction doesn't start until... I don't care. I'll pay double the estimated value. Triple. Just tell me what you need. 15 minutes later, Rebecca was loading the box into her car, the photograph with Carla and Thomas carefully wrapped in archival tissue paper. As she drove back through the rain toward Portland, her mind raced. She needed to get to her lab, needed proper equipment, needed to examine every photograph in that box with high-resolution scanning. Because if what she suspected was true, this wasn't just a circus photograph. It was evidence. That evening, Rebecca worked late at the Northwest Historical Archives. She'd laid out every photograph from the auction box on her examination table. Most were innocent enough. More circus scenes, fairground attractions, city streets. But 3 other photographs also featured Carla. In one, she stood beside the ostrich, wearing a costume covered in feathers. Her arms were raised in a theatrical pose, but Rebecca could see the marks. More scars, this time visible on both wrists and around her upper arms. In another, she was surrounded by a crowd of onlookers, all watching her interact with the bird. She was smiling, but Rebecca had seen enough forced expressions in historical photographs to recognize the difference between joy and performance. The third photograph made Rebecca call her department head. Dr. Michael Torres arrived within the hour. He was the lead researcher on exploitative labor practices in early American entertainment, and if anyone would understand the significance of what Rebecca had found, it was him. She didn't say anything at first, just pointed to the photograph now displayed on her lightbox. It showed Carla alone, this time in what appeared to be a backstage area. She wasn't smiling, wasn't performing. She was sitting on a wooden crate, her arms wrapped around herself, and the look on her face was one of absolute despair. But that wasn't what had made Rebecca call Michael. Visible in the corner of the frame, hanging from a tent pole, was a set of iron shackles. Michael leaned closer, his expression darkening as he took in the details. Where did you get this? Estate sale, Portland. The whole lot was labeled as generic circus memorabilia. Rebecca's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she gestured to the other photographs. There's more, a lot more, and I think we need to find out who Carla was. Do we have any other identifying information? Just the circus name, Müller's magnificent traveling show, Chicago-based, operating roughly 1910 to 1915. Rebecca pulled up her laptop, where she'd already begun compiling research. But here's what's interesting. The show disappears from all newspaper records after March 1915. No advertisements, no mentions, nothing. It's like it ceased to exist overnight. Michael frowned. That's unusual. Most traveling shows either merged with larger operations or went bankrupt with extensive documentation. Complete disappearances are rare. I know. Rebecca pulled up another document. And there's something else? I found a brief mention in a Chicago police report from April 1915. A fire at a storage facility near the stockyards. The report lists the property owner as Thomas Müller and notes that the fire destroyed various circus equipment and promotional materials. Suspicious. Very, especially since... Rebecca hesitated, then opened another file. Since I also found this, it was a death certificate. Thomas Müller. Date of death, March 23, 1915. Cause, accidental fire. Location, Müller Storage Facility, Chicago, Illinois. Michael straightened, his scholarly demeanor shifting to something more urgent. He died in that fire? According to this, yes. And Rebecca clicked to another document. There's no record of what happened to the circus after that. No inventory, no sale of assets, no insurance claims. It's as if everything connected to Thomas Müller and his traveling show was deliberately erased. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at the photographs spread across the examination table. All those images of Carla performing, smiling for the camera, playing her role. And in every single one, if you looked close enough, you could see the evidence of captivity. "We need to find out what happened to her," Michael said quietly. "To Carla, after the fire." Rebecca nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing, because there was one more detail she hadn't mentioned yet, one more piece of evidence that had been troubling her all evening. She picked up the original photograph, the one that had started everything, the one with Carla and Thomas and the ostrich. Using her magnifier, she pointed to a specific spot on the image, in the lower right corner, where the woman's dress touched the ground. "Look at this." Michael leaned in. At first he couldn't see what she was indicating. Then his eyes focused, and he inhaled sharply. It was barely visible, nearly lost in the shadows and folds of fabric, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The toe of a boot, small, feminine, emerging just slightly from beneath Carla's dress. But it was the wrong angle. Not positioned as if Carla herself was wearing it, but as if someone else was standing directly behind her, hidden by the voluminous skirt. Someone who wasn't supposed to be in the photograph. Someone who had been concealed. "There was another woman," Michael breathed. "Right there, the whole time." Rebecca set down the magnifier with shaking hands. "And if there was one hidden in this photograph, how many others were there? How many women did Thomas Müller have?" Before Michael could answer, Rebecca's phone buzzed. It was an email notification from the Chicago Historical Society, responding to a query she'd sent hours earlier. She opened it, scanned the contents, and felt the blood drain from her face. "What?" Michael demanded. "What is it?" Rebecca turned her laptop so he could see. The email contained an attached document, a digitized page from a Chicago hospital admission log, dated March 24, 1915. It listed 3 names, 3 women admitted for severe burns and smoke inhalation on the same night Thomas Müller died. One of the names was Carla. She'd survived the fire. But according to the hospital records, she'd refused to provide a last name, declined to identify her next of kin, and disappeared from the facility less than 48 hours after admission, against medical advice. The nurse's notes included one final detail. Patient departed during night hours. Personal effects left behind, including an unusual quantity of ash and what appeared to be partially burned rope. Rebecca looked at Michael. He looked back at her, and she could see her own realization reflected in his expression. Carla hadn't escaped the fire. She'd started it. Rebecca spent the next 4 days hunting for Carla's real name. It became an obsession. She barely left her office, surviving on coffee and takeout, while drowning in digitized newspaper archives, immigration records, and circus documentation from a dozen different sources. Thomas Müller proved easier to trace. Born in Hamburg, Germany in 1878, immigrated to New York in 1903, moved to Chicago by 1907. His traveling show appeared in municipal records starting in 1910, registered as a legitimate entertainment business. Tax documents, permit applications, property leases, everything looked normal on the surface. A successful immigrant entrepreneur living the American dream. But Carla was a ghost. No immigration record matched the timeline. No marriage certificate linked her to Thomas. No performer contracts in the circus archives at the Chicago Historical Society. It was as if she hadn't existed before that photograph, as if Thomas had conjured her into being just for his show. On the 4th night, Rebecca found something. Not in official records, but in a personal diary donated to the Northwestern University archives by a woman named Elizabeth Hayes, whose grandmother had worked as a seamstress in Chicago during the 1910s. The diary was mundane, mostly shopping lists and gossip about neighbors. But one entry from August 1911 stopped Rebecca cold. Saw Thomas Müller today at the market. He was inspecting the immigrant girls like livestock. Maria said he's looking for new exhibits for that terrible show of his. The poor creatures don't speak English, don't know what they're signing. It makes me sick. Immigrant girls. Rebecca's pulse quickened. She dove back into Ellis Island records with new search parameters, not looking for Carla as a first name, but as a variation. Caroline, Karolina, Carlotta, anything close that appeared in German, Polish, or Eastern European, manifest between 1908 and 1911. 3 days later, she found her, Karolina Nowak, age 19. Arrived at Ellis Island on June 14, 1910, from Krakow, Poland. Listed occupation, domestic servant. Destination, Chicago. Sponsor, Thomas Müller, identified as family friend and employer. Family friend. Rebecca's stomach turned. She pulled Karolina's immigration photograph from the digital archive. The image was standard, a young woman staring at the camera with the blank expression required by processing officials. But Rebecca recognized her immediately. The same eyes, the same delicate bone structure, visible beneath Carla's stage makeup in the Circus photographs. Karolina Nowak had been 19 years old when Thomas Müller brought her to America. 19 years old and completely alone in a foreign country, unable to speak English, with no family and no resources except the man who'd sponsored her entry. Rebecca found the contract. It was buried in a collection of miscellaneous legal documents at the Cook County Archives, filed under Employment Agreements, Entertainment Industry, 1910-1915. The language was deliberately vague, full of legal terminology designed to obscure rather than clarify. The undersigned party agrees to provide performance services for a period of 7 years in exchange for lodging, meals, and professional training in theatrical arts. All earnings shall be managed by the employer for the benefit of the performer, to be distributed at the conclusion of the contractual period. 7 years of servitude. No wages, no freedom, everything controlled by Thomas. And that was just the official document, the one filed with the county. Rebecca suspected there were other agreements, unofficial ones, that outlined the real terms of Karolina's captivity. She found 3 more women, 3 other immigrants, all sponsored by Thomas Müller between 1909 and 1913, all listed as performers in his traveling show, all without any immigration records after their initial entry. Helene Fischer from Bavaria, brought to Chicago in 1909 at age 17, Margareta Kowalski from Warsaw, arrived in 1912 at age 21, Inez Rodriguez from Catalonia, Spain, entered through New York in 1913 at age 18. Each one had signed similar contracts. Each one had disappeared into Thomas's operation, without leaving any trace in official records. No marriage licenses, no property ownership, no bank accounts, nothing that would indicate they had lives beyond their exhibition roles. Rebecca contacted the National Archives, requesting any federal investigation records related to Thomas Müller or his traveling show. What she received 3 weeks later made her hands shake. There had been an investigation. In 1914, a federal inspector named Robert Halloway had visited Müller's magnificent traveling show after receiving anonymous complaints about improper treatment of foreign-born performers. His report was brief and professionally sanitized, but reading between the lines, Rebecca could see what he'd found. Women performers housed in locked quarters, claimed this was for protection and moral propriety, observed several individuals with visible injuries, explained as accidents during animal handling. Interpreter noted, performers seemed reluctant to speak freely, frequently looking to Mr. Müller before answering questions. Strong odor of kerosene in living quarters. Meals appeared inadequate. Recommend follow-up inspection. The follow-up never happened. A month after Halloway filed his report, his supervisor closed the case, noting that all necessary permits appear to be in order, and complaints appear to originate from business competitors. Someone had killed the investigation, someone with enough influence to make a federal inquiry disappear. Rebecca dug deeper into Thomas Müller's finances. He wasn't just running a small circus. He owned 3 properties in Chicago, including a warehouse near the stockyards, the same one that would burn in 1915. He had bank accounts totaling over $45,000, an enormous sum for the time. And his show wasn't just playing county fairs and local festivals. Advertisements showed performances at some of Chicago's most prestigious venues, attracting wealthy patrons and city officials. Thomas Müller had been connected, protected, powerful enough that young immigrant women could vanish into his operation without anyone caring enough to look. But then Rebecca found the arrest record. November 1914. Thomas Müller charged with maintaining a disorderly house after a disturbance at his warehouse property. Details were sparse, but one witness statement stood out. A neighboring business owner reported hearing screaming in a foreign language and seeing a woman attempting to exit through a window before being forcibly restrained by Mr. Müller and two male employees. The charges were dropped within 48 hours. No explanation in the file, just a notation that the matter has been resolved privately. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning from hours of reading microfilm. She understood now. Thomas hadn't just exploited these women for profit. He'd imprisoned them, using their immigration status and language barriers as chains more effective than iron. They couldn't escape because they had nowhere to go, no resources, no understanding of American legal systems, and likely no papers beyond the contracts that bound them to Thomas. Karolina, whoever she truly was, had spent years performing for crowds while living in locked quarters, earning nothing, owning nothing, existing solely as Thomas's property in everything but legal name. Rebecca opened her laptop and searched for the other women's names, hoping to find some record of what happened to them after the fire. Helene Fisher appeared in a death record from 1913, cause listed as consumption, buried in a potter's field outside Chicago. No family claimed the body. Margreta Kowalski showed up in a Chicago police report from 1915, listed as a missing person. The report noted that no family in the United States is known, and the case was never actively pursued. Inez Rodriguez vanished completely from all records after her immigration entry in 1913. Of the 4 women whose names Rebecca had found, only Karolina had survived past 1915. Only Karolina had lived through the fire that killed Thomas Müller. Rebecca pulled up the hospital admission records again, studying the brief notes from the night of March 24, 1915. 3 women admitted with burns and smoke inhalation. Besides Karolina, 2 others, Jane Doe 1 and Jane Doe 2, both described as foreign-born, limited English. The other survivors, 2 women who'd been in that warehouse when it burned, who'd made it out alive alongside Karolina. The medical notes were clinical, but horrifying. 2nd and 3rd degree burns, malnutrition, old injuries including healed fractures and scarring consistent with prolonged physical abuse. One of the Jane Does had marks around her ankles that the examining physician noted as possibly from restraints. All 3 women refused to identify themselves beyond first names. All 3 left the hospital within 2 days, against medical advice, disappearing into Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods. Rebecca found one more document, a brief article from the Chicago Tribune, dated March 26, 1915, buried on page 7. Circus owner dies in warehouse fire. Thomas Müller, 37, proprietor of Müller's magnificent traveling show, perished in a fire at his storage facility near the Union Stockyards Tuesday evening. Authorities report the blaze began near midnight, destroying the building and all contents. Fire marshal suspects kerosene lamp as the cause. No foul play is suspected. Mr. Müller is survived by a brother in Hamburg, Germany. No foul play suspected. Despite 3 women escaping from a locked warehouse. Despite Thomas dying in a fire that coincidentally destroyed all evidence of his operation. Despite the timing, coming just months after federal investigators had noticed something wrong. Rebecca printed the article and pinned it to her research board next to Karolina's immigration photo and the circus photograph showing her scarred wrists. She stared at both images, at the 19-year-old who'd arrived in America with hope and the woman she'd become after years of captivity. There was one more piece of evidence Rebecca needed to find, the other women, the 2 Jane Does who'd escaped with Karolina. If she could identify them, if she could trace what happened after they left the hospital, maybe she could understand what had really occurred that night. She spent another week searching, using the limited details from the hospital records. Foreign-born women, early 20s, admitted to county hospital on March 24, 1915. One with a distinctive birthmark mentioned in the medical notes. Another with a partially healed fracture of the left radius. Finally, she found a lead, a death certificate from 1915 filed in May. Margareta Kowalski, cause of death. Injuries from an industrial accident. The certificate was signed by a different doctor than the one who'd treated her at the hospital, but the described injuries matched perfectly. Margareta hadn't vanished in 1915. She'd been one of the survivors. She'd escaped the fire with Karolina, only to die 2 months later from her burns. That meant the third woman, the other Jane Doe, was still unaccounted for. Rebecca searched for weeks but found nothing. No death certificate, no hospital records, no trace in any archive she could access. Until the phone call. It was late June when Rebecca's office line rang. She almost didn't answer, exhausted from another long day of research. But something made her pick up. "Dr. Chen?" The voice was elderly, uncertain. "My name is Anna Kowalski. I saw your name in an article about historical research on immigration. I think you might be looking for information about my grandmother." Rebecca's heart stopped. "Your grandmother?" "Margareta Kowalski. She came from Poland in 1912. I've been trying to trace her story for years, but there's so little documentation. The family always said she worked in a circus, that something terrible happened. Is that what you're researching?" Rebecca's hand trembled as she reached for her notes. "Mrs. Kowalski, I think you should come to my office. There's something you need to see." Anna Kowalski arrived the next day. She was 73 years old, the daughter of Margareta's only child, born in Chicago in 1916. What she told Rebecca filled in pieces of the story that no document could have revealed. Margareta had survived the warehouse fire. She'd escaped with 2 other women, one named Karolina, and another whose name Anna's grandmother never learned to pronounce correctly. They'd stayed together for several weeks after leaving the hospital, hiding in a Polish neighborhood on the northwest side. Margareta died from her injuries in May, but before she passed, she'd told her daughter what happened in that warehouse, how Thomas had kept them locked up between performances, how he'd beaten them when they didn't perform well, how he'd threatened to have them deported if they tried to escape, how the kerosene lamps in their sleeping quarters were deliberately locked from the outside, trapping them in a fire hazard every night, and how, on the night of March 23, 1915, Karolina had picked the lock. "My grandmother said Karolina was the smart one," Anna explained, her voice shaking. She'd been watching Thomas, learning his routines, figuring out his weaknesses. She'd been planning the escape for months. That night, she got them all out of the locked room. They were heading for the exit when Thomas discovered them. Rebecca felt her blood run cold. "What happened?" "There was a fight. Thomas tried to stop them. One of the kerosene lamps got knocked over. My grandmother always said it was an accident, but..." Anna paused, choosing her words carefully. "But she also said Karolina had been standing right next to that lamp when it fell, and that she didn't try very hard to catch it. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been set deliberately during a desperate fight for freedom. The women had escaped, but Thomas Müller had burned alive in the warehouse he'd used to imprison them." Rebecca opened her laptop and pulled up the hospital records, showing Anna the admission notes for all 3 women. "Do you know what happened to Karolina after your grandmother died?" Anna shook her head. "She disappeared. My grandmother told my mother that Karolina left Chicago right after the funeral, said she was going west. She promised to write, but never did. Nobody knew her real last name, so there was no way to trace her. But Rebecca had her last name now, Karolina Nowak, which meant she could search again, this time with complete information. It took 3 more weeks, but Rebecca finally found her. Not in Chicago, but in San Francisco. A naturalization record from 1921 for Karolina Nowak, now going by the Americanized name Karolina Nowak. Occupation listed as seamstress. Married to Henry Schmidt, a dock worker, in 1919. She'd survived, she'd escaped, started over, built a life. Rebecca traced Caroline through census records, city directories, property records. She found her death certificate from 1967, listing her age as 76. Survived by 3 children, 7 grandchildren. The obituary from a small San Francisco newspaper described her as a beloved mother and grandmother, known for her kindness to new immigrants in the neighborhood. There was a photo with the obituary, an elderly woman with white hair, smiling at the camera, surrounded by family. Rebecca stared at her face, trying to see the terrified 19-year-old who'd arrived at Ellis Island, the captive performer in Circus photographs, the woman who'd picked a lock and burned down her prison. The smile in the obituary photo looked genuine, real, nothing like the forced expression in those circus images. Caroline had escaped. She'd won. But Rebecca couldn't stop thinking about the others. Helene, dead from tuberculosis in Thomas's custody. Inez, vanished completely. Margareta, dying from her burns just weeks after gaining freedom. And all the women whose names she'd never found, who'd passed through Thomas Müller's operation and left no trace at all. She was preparing to write up her findings, to publish an article about this forgotten piece of Chicago's dark history, when the second phone call came. Dr. Chen, this is Detective Sarah Martinez, San Francisco Police Department, Cold Case Division. I understand you've been researching a woman named Karolina Nowak, also known as Karolina Nowak. Rebecca's throat went dry. Yes, why? We've just reopened an investigation into a death from 1967. Karolina Nowak's death, specifically. New evidence suggests her death might not have been natural causes as originally reported. I'd like to discuss your research, particularly anything related to her time in Chicago between 1910 and 1915. I thought she died of old age. The obituary said, the obituary was wrong. Martinez's voice was grim. Caroline died from poisoning. Arsenic, to be specific. Someone killed her, Dr. Chen. And we think it might be connected to something that happened in Chicago 50 years earlier. Something involving a man named Thomas Müller and a warehouse fire. Does that name mean anything to you? Rebecca stared at her research board, at the photographs of Karolina, at the documents chronicling Thomas's crimes, at the evidence of the fire that had killed him. Thomas Müller had died in 1915. He'd burned alive in that warehouse, exactly as the death certificate stated. So, who had killed Caroline in 1967? And why had they waited 52 years? Rebecca flew to San Francisco 3 days later. Detective Martinez met her at the police station with a file folder that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. We found this during a records digitization project, Martinez explained, sliding the folder across the table. Original investigation from 1967. The case was ruled natural causes within 48 hours, but the toxicology report tells a different story. Rebecca opened the folder. The first page showed Karolina Nowak's death certificate. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. But someone had paperclipped a handwritten note to the document. Arsenic levels inconsistent with accidental exposure. Recommend further investigation. Dr. R. Yamamoto, medical examiner. Why wasn't this pursued? Rebecca asked. Martinez's expression darkened. Because 3 days after Dr. Yamamoto filed his recommendation, the case was closed by his supervisor. No explanation in the file, just a stamp that says insufficient evidence to proceed. Rebecca flipped through the folder. Crime scene photos showed Caroline's modest home in the Richmond district, a cup of tea on the kitchen table, a half-eaten sandwich. Everything looked peaceful, domestic, except for one photograph that made Rebecca's breath catch. On Caroline's nightstand, visible in the corner of a bedroom shot, sat a small wooden box. Even in the grainy photograph, Rebecca could see it wasn't empty. Did anyone inventory the contents of that box? She asked. Martinez shook her head. According to the property log, the family cleared out the house before we could do a detailed search. That box, whatever was in it, is long gone. But Rebecca had seen enough. She pulled out her laptop and opened the photographs from the Portland auction house, the ones showing Carla at the circus. She zoomed in on one particular image, the backstage shot showing Carla sitting alone. There, partially hidden beneath her crate, was the same wooden box. She kept it, Rebecca breathed. For 50 years she kept it. Kept what? Evidence of what Thomas did to her. Rebecca's mind raced. Think about it. Caroline escaped in 1915, built a new life, raised a family. Why would someone kill her in 1967? What changed? Martinez pulled out another document. Her grandson told us she'd been contacted by a writer a few months before she died. Someone researching Chicago entertainment history. Caroline had agreed to an interview, said she had stories to tell about the old days. Rebecca felt ice in her stomach. Did the writer's name make it into the report? No, the grandson couldn't remember it. just that Caroline seemed nervous about the meeting, like she was afraid of what might happen if she talked. She never made it to that interview, did she? She died 3 days before the scheduled date. Rebecca stood and walked to the window, staring out at the San Francisco skyline. Somewhere in this city, in 1967, someone had learned that Karolina Nowak was about to speak publicly about Thomas Müller's crimes. Someone who had enough to lose that they'd committed murder to keep her silent. "I need to see her family," Rebecca said. "The grandchildren. They might know something?" 2 hours later, Rebecca sat in a coffee shop in the Sunset District across from Caroline's granddaughter, Julia Schmidt-Chen. She was 63 years old, a retired teacher, and she held a photograph that made Rebecca's hands shake when she saw it. It showed a young Caroline, maybe in her 30s, standing with 3 children. But it wasn't the children that caught Rebecca's attention. It was what Caroline wore around her neck, a locket, silver with an ornate pattern. "My grandmother never took that off," Julia said quietly. "She wore it every day of her life. When she died, it disappeared. We assumed one of the other grandchildren took it as a keepsake, but no one ever admitted to having it." "Can you describe it?" "It was old, European style. She said it came from Poland, from before she immigrated. Inside were 2 photographs, but she never showed anyone what they were." Julia paused. "There was something else, an inscription on the back. I only saw it once when I was little. It said something in Polish." Rebecca pulled out her phone and opened a translation app. "Do you remember any of the words?" Julia closed her eyes, reaching back across decades. "Pamiętam, that was one word, and coś o nocy, something about night." Rebecca typed the words into her translator. "Pamiętam, I remember, nocy, of the night." "I remember the night," she whispered. Julia nodded slowly. "After she died, my mother found her journal, just 1 volume, written in the months before her death. The police looked at it, but found nothing suspicious, so they gave it back to us. Most of it was ordinary stuff, recipes, notes about her garden. But there was one entry that none of us understood." She pulled a folded paper from her purse. "I made a copy. The original is at my mother's house." Rebecca unfolded the paper. It was written in English, in shaky handwriting, that suggested Caroline had been upset when she wrote it. "March 8th, 1967. He found me. After all these years, I thought I was safe. I thought they'd all died or forgotten. But his son came today, asking questions. He knows about the warehouse. He knows about his father. He says he just wants to understand what happened, but his eyes are the same cold eyes. If something happens to me, if I die suddenly, someone needs to know the truth. The photographs are in the box, the real ones, not the performance ones, the ones that show what he did to us in the locked rooms. I kept them because I knew someone like his son would come eventually. Men like Thomas Müller don't raise good children. They raise monsters who protect monsters." Rebecca read the entry 3 times, each word burning into her memory. His son. Thomas had a child? "Apparently," Julia said. "My mother did some research after we found the journal. Thomas Müller had a son born in Germany in 1900, brought to America in 1904. His name was Friedrich Müller. He would have been 67 years old in 1967. Do you know what happened to him? He died in 1968, car accident in Los Angeles. But here's the thing," Julia leaned forward, her voice dropping. "The accident happened exactly 1 year and 2 days after my grandmother died. And according to the police report, his car crashed into a concrete barrier at 80 miles per hour on a straight, clear stretch of highway. No brake marks, no attempt to swerve." Rebecca stared at her. "You think someone killed him too." "I think my grandmother wasn't the only one with secrets she wanted to protect." Julia pulled out another photograph, this one showing an elderly man at what appeared to be a funeral. "This was taken at my grandmother's service. We didn't know who he was, didn't remember seeing him there. We found this photo years later when we were organizing old albums. Look at his hands." Rebecca examined the image. The man was well-dressed, standing apart from the other mourners, and in his right hand, barely visible, he held something small and silver, a locket. "He took it," Rebecca said. "Friedrich came to Caroline's funeral and stole the locket from her casket. That's what we think. But why? What was in those photographs that was worth killing for 50 years after the original crime?" Rebecca knew the answer. She'd seen enough of Thomas Müller's operation to understand. The photographs Caroline kept weren't just evidence of imprisonment and abuse. They showed names, faces, locations. They could implicate people who'd been complicit in Thomas's trafficking operation. Business partners, corrupt officials, maybe even Friedrich himself, if he'd been involved in his father's crimes. Julia, did your grandmother ever mention other women? Other people who'd been in the warehouse with her? She talked about Margareta sometimes, said she'd been her best friend, that she'd died too young. But there was someone else. Julia's brow furrowed. Someone she never named. She called her the girl who couldn't speak. I always assumed she meant someone who didn't speak English, but what? One time, when I was maybe 10 years old, I asked my grandmother why she couldn't speak, and my grandmother got this look on her face, like she was seeing something horrible. She said, because he took her voice, literally took it. That's what he did to the ones who screamed too much. The room seemed to tilt. Rebecca gripped the edge of the table. What are you saying? I'm saying Thomas Müller didn't just beat and starve those women. He mutilated them. He cut out their tongues, Dr. Chen. He permanently silenced the ones who tried to fight back. Rebecca thought she might be sick. All her research, all the documents and photographs, she'd understood intellectually what had happened in that warehouse. But this was different. This was torture, deliberate and systematic. The girl who couldn't speak, she managed. Do you know what happened to her? My grandmother said she survived the fire, but died within the year. Infection, probably. But before she died, she gave my grandmother something. A gift, my grandmother called it. Something to remember her by. What was it? Julia reached into her bag and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. This. My grandmother kept it hidden her whole life. My mother only found it after the journal, tucked inside a hollowed-out book on her shelf. She unwrapped the tissue paper. It was a lockpick. Old, hand-forged from a piece of metal that looked like it had been carved from a spoon handle. Crude, but effective. The tool Karolina had used to free them all. She made it herself, Julia said softly. Over months, maybe years. Filed it down in secret, hid it from Thomas. The girl who couldn't speak gave it to my grandmother as a way of saying thank you, for being her friend, for not leaving her behind when they escaped. Rebecca took the lockpick with trembling hands. It was light, barely weighing anything, but it represented something enormous. It was proof of resistance, of survival, of women who'd been imprisoned and silenced, but who'd fought back anyway. There's something else, Julia said. Something in my grandmother's journal that I didn't understand until now. She wrote it 3 days before she died, right after Friedrich's visit. She pulled out another folded paper. She wrote, I told him I destroyed the photographs. I lied. They're not in the box at home. I gave them to someone who will know what to do with them if anything happens to me, someone Friedrich will never find. Who? Rebecca demanded. Who did she give them to? That's what I've been trying to figure out for 50 years. Julia's eyes met Rebecca's. But I think I finally know. My grandmother had a close friend, another immigrant woman who'd survived her own traumas. They met in the 1920s, stayed friends until my grandmother died. Her name was Inez Rodriguez. Rebecca's blood turned to ice. Inez Rodriguez from Barcelona? Julia's eyes widened. You know about her? She was one of the other women, one of Thomas's victims. But I couldn't find any record of her after 1913. I thought she'd died. She didn't die. She changed her name after the fire, went into hiding, same as my grandmother. They found each other decades later, recognized each other somehow, despite the years. They never spoke about what happened in front of us grandchildren, but we knew they shared something dark and painful. Where is Inez now? She died in 1975, but her daughter is still alive. She lives in Oakland. Julia wrote an address on a napkin and slid it across the table. Her name is Mercedes. She's expecting you. Expecting me? I called her this morning, told her about you, about your research. She said she's been waiting for someone like you for a long time. Julia stood to leave, then paused. Dr. Chen, before you go see Mercedes, there's one more thing you should know, about Friedrich Müller. What about him? His car accident in 1968? It happened on the same stretch of highway where a traveling circus had set up camp. The police report noted it, but didn't think it was relevant. The circus moved on the next day, and no one thought to investigate further. What kind of circus? Julia's voice was barely a whisper. It was called Fernandez Family Spectacular. Mercedes' married name is Fernandez. And in 1968, her husband owned a traveling show that performed up and down the California coast. Rebecca stared at her. The implications crashed over her like a wave. Caroline hadn't just hidden the photographs. She'd given them to Inez. And when Friedrich came looking for revenge, when he murdered Caroline to keep her silent, Inez and her family had hunted him down and killed him. The women Thomas had trapped, the ones he'd tortured and degraded and tried to erase from history, they hadn't just survived. They'd become hunters themselves. Mercedes Fernandez lived in a Victorian house in Oakland's Fruitvale district. She was 82 years old, and when she opened the door, Rebecca saw Inez Rodriguez staring back at her across 50 years. "You have my mother's eyes," Rebecca said without thinking. Mercedes smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who'd spent a lifetime keeping secrets. "Come in, Dr. Chen. We've been expecting someone like you for a very long time." The living room was filled with photographs, family pictures covering every wall, spanning generations. But Rebecca's attention fixed on one frame above the fireplace. It showed 3 women, all elderly, standing together in what appeared to be the 1960s. She recognized Caroline immediately. Next to her stood 2 other women, their arms linked, their faces showing the kind of bond that only shared trauma can create. "My mother, Caroline and Maria," Mercedes said, following Rebecca's gaze. "The 3 who survived." "Maria? The girl who couldn't speak. Yes." Mercedes gestured for Rebecca to sit. Her real name was Maria Castellano, from Valencia. Thomas cut out her tongue in 1913 when she tried to scream for help during a performance. He told the audience she was a silent wonder, born mute. People paid extra to see her. Rebecca felt bile rise in her throat. "My mother kept everything," Mercedes continued, walking to an antique cabinet. "She said someday someone would come asking the right questions, someone who'd actually care about what happened to them." She pulled out a wooden box, identical to the one Rebecca had seen in the photograph. "These are the photographs Caroline gave her, the ones Friedrich killed for." Mercedes opened the box. Inside were dozens of photographs, but these weren't performance shots. These showed the locked rooms, women in chains, visible injuries, and faces, so many faces, some Rebecca recognized from her research, others she'd never seen. But what made Rebecca's hands shake was what else the photographs showed. Men. White men in expensive suits, standing with Thomas, shaking his hand, touring the facilities. "Business partners," Mercedes said quietly. "Chicago politicians, wealthy investors, men who knew exactly what Thomas was doing and who helped him do it. Some of them paid to visit the women. Between performances." Rebecca examined the faces. She recognized several from her historical research: a prominent judge, 2 city council members, a successful banker who'd later become a state senator. "This is why Friedrich came for Caroline," Rebecca said. "These photographs could have destroyed families, political legacies, business empires. Friedrich's own career would have ended," Mercedes confirmed. He'd built a respectable life in Los Angeles, real estate developer, married to a judge's daughter, 3 children. But he'd worked for his father from 1912 to 1915. He was there, Dr. Chen. He knew everything. He helped his father acquire women, helped lock them up, helped silence anyone who asked questions. And he was in these photographs. Mercedes pulled out one specific image. A young Friedrich, maybe 17 years old, standing next to Thomas in front of the warehouse. In the background, barely visible through a window, were several women's faces. When Caroline agreed to that interview in 1967, Friedrich panicked. He'd spent 50 years burying his past. He wasn't going to let an old Polish woman destroy everything he'd built. So he poisoned her. Arsenic in her tea made it look like a heart attack. The coroner was paid off, same as his father had paid off officials for years. Mercedes' voice hardened. But he made one mistake. He came to her funeral. He took her locket. My mother recognized him immediately. Rebecca thought of the circus, of Friedrich's car crash. "What did you do?" "My husband's circus had an act, a lion tamer who'd been with us for 20 years. His name was Paulo, and he'd been born in a village outside Barcelona. His sister had disappeared in 1913, sold to a traveling show in America. He'd spent his entire life looking for her, never knowing what happened." "Maria," Rebecca breathed. "We showed Paulo the photographs. showed him what Thomas Müller had done to his sister, showed him Friedrich's face. And when Friedrich's business took him to California that next year, when his route happened to pass by our circus, Mercedes paused. Paolo was very good with mechanical work, brake lines, specifically. You murdered him. We executed him, Mercedes corrected, for crimes he'd committed 50 years ago, crimes he'd never been punished for, crimes that were about to be forgotten entirely. She closed the box. My mother, Caroline, and Maria, they all agreed. Some men don't get to escape justice just because time has passed. Rebecca stared at the photographs spread across the coffee table. Evidence of systematic trafficking, torture, rape. Evidence of powerful men's complicity. Evidence that had been hidden for over a century. Why didn't you go public? Why keep these hidden? Mercedes' laugh was bitter. Who would have cared in 1968? 3 old immigrant women accusing dead men of the crimes from 50 years ago. We had no legal standing, no money for lawyers, no political connections. And half the men in these photographs had sons and grandsons in positions of power. We would have been destroyed, and the photographs would have been dismissed as fakes. But things are different now. The No Me Too movement, historical reckoning. That's why I agreed to meet you. Mercedes pulled out one final photograph. This one showed Caroline, Inez, and Maria together in 1975, just months before Inez died. They were holding a banner that read, "We Remember." My mother made me promise that when the right person came, someone who would actually tell the truth, I would give them everything. She said, "Our revenge was personal, but the story needs to be public." Mercedes met Rebecca's eyes. "So here's the deal, Dr. Chen. You can have these photographs. You can publish your research. You can tell the world what Thomas Müller did and who helped him do it. What's the condition? You tell all of it, not just the suffering. Tell them about the lockpick Caroline made. Tell them about Maria learning to write with her left hand after Thomas broke her right. Tell them about my mother changing her name and building a new life. Tell them that we hunted Friedrich down and killed him and that we don't regret it. Tell them we weren't just victims. We were survivors who became warriors." Rebecca looked at the photographs, at the evidence, at the faces of women who'd been erased from history. She thought about her article, about how she'd planned to write it as a historical tragedy, a story of suffering and loss. But Mercedes was right. This wasn't just a story about what had been done to these women. It was a story about what they'd done in response. "I'll tell it all," Rebecca promised. Mercedes nodded slowly, then reached into the box one last time. She pulled out a small envelope, sealed with wax. "There's one more thing. My mother wrote this in 1974, a year before she died. She said it was for whoever finally told the story. She made me swear not to open it." Rebecca took the envelope with trembling hands. The wax seal was still intact. She broke it carefully and pulled out a single piece of paper, covered in Inez's handwriting. The letter was in Spanish, but Rebecca's phone translated it easily. "To whoever reads this, by the time you find these photographs, we will all be dead. Caroline, Maria, and I. We lived long enough to see justice done, even if it was justice we had to create ourselves. We lived long enough to become more than what Thomas Müller tried to make us. We had children, grandchildren, lives that mattered, but every night I still dream about the others, the ones who didn't survive. Helene, who died coughing blood in that warehouse. Margareta, who burned with us but never healed. The girl from Russia whose name I never learned. The woman from Portugal who tried to escape and was beaten so badly she never walked again. All the ones whose photographs Thomas burned, whose names were never recorded, whose families never knew what happened to them. This is for them. Remember them. Say their names. Tell their stories. And if you find any of their descendants, tell them this. Their mothers, sisters, daughters, they fought. They didn't break. Even in that hell, they held on to their humanity. They protected each other. They dreamed of freedom, and 3 of us made it out alive. We won. Not completely, not cleanly, but we won. That's what Thomas Müller never understood. You can cage a woman, silence her, hurt her, but you can never completely destroy her, because survival is its own form of victory, and revenge, when it finally comes, is sweeter than any freedom. Inez Rodriguez, 1974. Rebecca sat in silence, the letter shaking in her hands. Mercedes was crying quietly, seeing her mother's words for the first time. "She never told you what she wrote?" She said I'd know when the time was right. Mercedes wiped her eyes. I understand now. She needed someone outside the family to read it first, to carry it into the world. Rebecca carefully returned the letter to its envelope. She looked at all the photographs, at decades of hidden history, at evidence of crimes and courage, suffering and survival. There's something I need to know, Rebecca said. The fire in 1915. Caroline told her family that Thomas died in the fire, that it was set during an escape attempt. But was it really an accident? Mercedes smiled, and this time it was genuine. My mother told me that story once, near the end of her life. She was very specific about the details, said she wanted someone to know the truth. What happened? Caroline picked the lock, just like everyone thinks. She got herself, my mother, and Maria out of their room. They were heading for the exit when Thomas caught them. He was drunk, which was unusual for him. He'd been celebrating a successful negotiation to sell the warehouse and move his operation to California, where he could start fresh with new women. Rebecca felt sick. There was a fight. Thomas grabbed Maria, threatened to kill her unless the others went back to their rooms. Caroline was holding a kerosene lamp, one of the ones that lit the warehouse. And my mother spoke to her in Polish, just 3 words. What words? Zrob to teraz, do it now. Rebecca's blood ran cold. Caroline threw the lamp at Thomas's feet. The kerosene ignited immediately. The warehouse was full of dry wood, canvas, straw. It went up in seconds. They ran, and behind them, they could hear Thomas screaming. Not screaming for help, screaming in rage, screaming their names, threatening what he'd do when he caught them. He never caught them. He burned alive in the warehouse he'd built to cage them. And the fire destroyed all his records, all his documentation, everything that proved what he'd done. When investigators came, all they found was a tragic accident, a warehouse fire that killed an unfortunate businessman. Mercedes paused. The irony is beautiful, don't you think? He spent years erasing these women from history, and in the end, his own history was erased by the same women. Rebecca gathered the photographs carefully, placing them back in the box. This was more than historical research now. This was evidence of crimes, evidence of justice, evidence of survival. I'm going to need time to process all of this, to write it properly. Take all the time you need, Mercedes said. These women waited 100 years to have their story told. A few more months won't matter. Rebecca stood to leave, the box held carefully in her arms. At the door, she turned back. Mercedes, one more question. If Friedrich hadn't come after Caroline, if he'd just left all of you alone, would you still have killed him? Mercedes' smile turned cold. Dr. Chen, we spent 50 years looking for him. Caroline's murder just gave us an excuse. We would have found him eventually. And when we did, justice would have been served. That's premeditated murder. That's poetic justice. There's a difference. She opened the door. Drive safely. Those photographs are worth killing for, as Friedrich learned. I'd hate for anything to happen to them, or to you. Rebecca drove back to Portland with the box beside her, her mind racing. She had everything she needed now, the photographs, the testimony, the documentary evidence. She could write an article that would change how people understood human trafficking in early 20th century America. She could name names, expose crimes, honor the dead. But as she crossed the Oregon border, a thought occurred to her that made her pull over at a rest stop. She opened the box again, counting the photographs carefully. Then she opened her research files, cross-referencing with the women she'd identified through immigration records. Something was wrong. She'd found records for 4 women: Karolina, Helene, Margareta, and Inez. Caroline had mentioned a girl who couldn't speak, who turned out to be Maria. That made 5 women. But there were photographs of 7 different women in the box. 2 faces Rebecca had never seen before. Women who'd left no immigration records, no documentation, nothing that proved they'd ever existed. Rebecca pulled out her phone and called Mercedes. I found 2 more women in the photographs. Who are they? There was a long pause on the other end. I was wondering if you'd noticed that, Mercedes said finally. My mother called them the ghosts, women Thomas acquired through different channels, not through Ellis Island, not through legal immigration. Women who simply disappeared one day and ended up in his warehouse. Human trafficking, in the most literal sense, kidnapped from ports, from train stations, from anywhere vulnerable women could be found. My mother didn't know their names. They didn't speak English or any language the others recognized. They disappeared before the fire, probably sold to other operations when Thomas needed cash. So they're still out there somewhere, or their descendants are. If they survived. Mercedes' voice was heavy. That's the part my mother could never make peace with. She saved herself, Caroline, and Maria. But she couldn't save everyone. She couldn't even remember their faces clearly by the end. Just that they'd been young, terrified, and then gone. Rebecca looked at the two photographs. The women were barely visible in the shots, background figures and images focused on Thomas and his business partners. But their eyes, even in the grainy photos, showed everything. "I'll find them," Rebecca heard herself say. "Or at least try. Facial recognition and software, genealogical databases, DNA testing if we can find any descendants. These women deserve to be remembered too." "Good," Mercedes said. "That's why my mother chose you. She knew you'd care about all of them, not just the ones with happy endings." Rebecca ended the call and sat in her car, staring at the photographs. The story she'd thought was complete suddenly had new chapters, new mysteries, new ghosts demanding to be heard. She picked up the original photograph from the Portland auction, the one that had started everything. Carla and Thomas and the ostrich, that seemingly innocent circus portrait. Looking at it now, Rebecca could see everything she'd missed. The scars on Carla's wrists, the fear in her eyes, the possessive grip of Thomas's hand, the woman hidden in the background, the caged figure barely visible in the shadows. But she could also see what she hadn't noticed before. In the corner of the photograph, reflected in a window behind Thomas, was another figure, a man with a camera, documenting everything. A photographer who'd knowingly captured evidence of crimes and sold those photographs as entertainment. Rebecca realized with growing horror that the story was even bigger than she'd thought. It wasn't just Thomas Müller, it was an entire industry, an entire system, an entire society that had looked at women like Karolina and seen only exotic curiosities, entertainment, property. She pulled out her laptop and began to type. This 1912 circus photograph looked peaceful until experts discovered what the woman was hiding. But the real horror wasn't hidden at all. It was right there in plain sight, visible to anyone who bothered to look. And for over a century, no one did. Rebecca drove through the night, the photographs beside her, and began to write the story that 3 women had died protecting and 3 others had died waiting to tell. A story about cages and keys, silence and screams, violence and survival. A story that wasn't over yet, because somewhere out there, descendants of those 2 unnamed women were living their lives, never knowing that their grandmothers had been erased from history. But not anymore. Not if Rebecca had anything to say about it. She pressed the accelerator and headed home, ready to burn down another warehouse made of lies.